In mid-century Hollywood, your private life wasn't actually private, it was studio property. When you signed a network contract to play a beloved sitcom character, you weren't just agreeing to memorize lines, you were agreeing to a heavily monitored illusion. For these 10 television legends, the characters that made them famous also became their prisons. If the public found out they were gay, the industry wouldn't just cancel their shows, it would erase them entirely. Here is how they survived the golden age of television by playing the most exhausting roles of their lives. Number 1. Robert Reed. To understand Robert Reed, you have to look at the living room of the Brady house. For 5 seasons, Reed sat on that recognizable couch and delivered earnest moral advice to 6 television children, cementing Mike Brady as the ultimate American father. The network sold an image of suburban perfection, and millions of viewers bought it. But for Reed, a classically trained Shakespearean actor, that soundstage often felt like a cage. The tension between Reed and the producers of The Brady Bunch is a well-documented piece of television history. He constantly argued over the script's light, highly sanitized tone. Yet, the deeper friction wasn't just about artistic integrity. Reed was a gay man navigating a dual life at a time when leading men, especially those playing wholesome family patriarchs, were contractually obligated to project an unwavering traditional masculinity. If his private reality had surfaced in the early 1970s, the studio would have almost certainly pulled the plug on his career overnight. So he performed the role the industry demanded. He went to work, hit his marks, and became the face of a very specific domestic ideal. The quiet paradox is that the very character making him internationally famous was the antithesis of the life he had to hide. Reed deeply resented the simplistic, artificial world of Mike Brady, perhaps because it represented the kind of acceptable packaged existence he was expected to emulate, but never actually could. He maintained this compartmentalized reality long after the sitcom ended. It was only after his passing in 1992 that the broader public learned the facts behind the television dad. They grew up with a man who spent his career providing comfort to millions while operating under the constant pressure of concealment. Number 2. Jim Nabors. When television audiences tuned in to watch Gomer Pyle, they were looking for a very specific kind of comfort. Jim Nabors delivered it flawlessly. With his wide-eyed optimism, thick Southern drawl, and famous catchphrases, Nabors embodied a pure, uncorrupted American innocence. He was the wholesome country boy everyone felt they knew. But the reality of working in 1960s Hollywood was far less forgiving than the fictional town of Mayberry. Behind the scenes, Nabors was a gay man forced to navigate an industry that actively monitored the private lives of its stars. The contrast between his naive open-book television persona and the intensely guarded nature of his actual life was stark. The pressure wasn't just abstract. When a fabricated malicious rumor circulated in the early 1970s linking him to Rock Hudson, it didn't just threaten his bankability. It forced 2 friends to distance themselves from one another simply to survive the studio system. The machinery of fame required Nabors to remain the perpetual harmless bachelor, freezing him in the amber of his sitcom persona. To find actual peace, he eventually had to put an ocean between himself and the industry. Nabors relocated to Hawaii, stepping away from the relentless scrutiny of Los Angeles to build a quiet, private life far from the cameras. It wasn't until 2013, at the age of 82, that he married his partner of nearly 4 decades, Stan Cadwallader. The man who made a career playing a wholesome television icon had to wait until that career was long behind him to openly acknowledge the most enduring relationship of his life. Number 3. Marjorie Maine. Hollywood had a very specific way of handling rumors about its female stars, often relying on a kind of willful ignorance that simply didn't apply to its leading men. Marjorie Maine is a fascinating example of this industry blind spot. To millions of mid-century moviegoers, she was Ma Kettle, the loud, fiercely independent but deeply traditional rural matriarch of a sprawling 15-child family. She was the rough-hewn mother figure of American comedy, an image so wholesome and specific that it provided a nearly impenetrable shield. In reality, following the death of her husband, Maine built a quiet, decades-long life with her fellow actress Spring Byington. The two women lived in a deeply committed partnership, sharing their days and traveling together far away from the glare of the studio lights. However, the studio system and the press at the time possessed a highly convenient vocabulary for this. Instead of facing the intense, career-ending scrutiny that male actors endured, female partnerships were often dismissed or rebranded by publicists as devoted friendships or eccentric companionships. Maine didn't have to orchestrate elaborate public dates with men to throw off the tabloids. Her protection came from the very nature of her typecasting. Because she played unglamorous older mother figures rather than conventional romantic leads, the studio executives didn't view her private life as a threat to their box office returns. The industry essentially allowed her to hide in plain sight, proving that in classic Hollywood, an actor's survival often depended not just on keeping a secret, but on whether the studio found that secret financially inconvenient. Number 4. Paul Lynde. If you turned on a television in the 1970s, it was almost impossible to avoid Paul Lynde. Sitting in the center square of the Hollywood squares, he delivered razor-sharp, campy punchlines to millions of Americans every week. His delivery was flamboyant, highly stylized, and heavily coated with gay subtext. The audience roared with laughter, fully embracing his theatrical wit. Yet they embraced it strictly on the condition that it remained a punchline. Lynde occupied what industry historians often call the glass closet. His sexuality was an open secret, heavily implied through his performance as Uncle Arthur on Bewitched and his endless game show appearances. The paradox of his career was that television networks paid him handsomely to perform a caricature of a gay man, but the unwritten rules of the era forbade him from actually living as one openly and with dignity. He was allowed to be the flamboyant court jester, safely contained within a box on a game show set so long as he never demanded the respect of a leading man. Living on that particular tightrope took a heavy toll. Recognizing that you are loved by the public only when playing a stereotype breeds a very specific kind of bitterness. Away from the cameras, the quick-witted center square struggled with a profound sense of isolation, often turning to alcohol to manage the frustration of a career built on self-deprecation. He was arguably one of the most visible gay men in American media during his peak, yet he was entirely silenced by the very industry that profited off his personality. America loved the performance, but they demanded the person behind it remain invisible. Number 5. Charles Nelson Reilly. If you picture Charles Nelson Reilly, you likely see the oversized glasses, the ascots, and the theatrical exasperation that made him a legendary fixture on Match Game. Throughout the 1970s, he was an absolute master of daytime television banter. His entire persona was wildly flamboyant and undeniably queer, yet the American public embraced him completely. They invited him into their living rooms every afternoon, so long as his identity remained comfortably framed as harmless eccentricity. The reality of Reilly's life was starkly different from the chaotic panelist he played on television. Away from the game show sets, he was a deeply serious Tony Award-winning stage actor and a highly respected Broadway director. But television executives in that era rarely knew what to do with a man who didn't fit the traditional mold of masculinity. They largely ignored his artistic gravitas and instead commodified his flamboyance, turning him into a reliable punchline. While he was making millions of people laugh by playing the quintessential fussy bachelor, he was actually going home to a quiet, remarkably stable life. Reilly shared a committed long-term relationship with Patrick Hughes, a partnership that lasted for decades. But the unwritten rules of mid-century broadcasting dictated that while his exaggerated television persona was highly profitable, his actual grounded relationship was completely unacceptable for public consumption. He didn't have to hide his personality. In fact, the networks demanded he amplify it. What he was forced to hide was his normalcy. The industry was perfectly happy to broadcast the performance, but they entirely erased the man behind it. Number 6. Cesar Romero. In classic Hollywood, there was a very specific coded phrase often printed in fan magazines to describe a certain type of leading man, the confirmed bachelor. It was a polite, industry-approved loophole, and Cesar Romero utilized it better than almost anyone else in the business. Long before he became a pop culture icon playing the Joker on the 1960s Batman series, Romero was marketed as a quintessential Latin lover. He was tall, striking, and frequently cast opposite the most glamorous leading ladies of the era. The studios relied heavily on his masculine appeal to sell tickets, meaning his private life was a constant liability to their bottom line. To survive in an environment where a single tabloid exposé could end a career, Romero adopted a strategy of calculated, intentional silence. He never married, but he mastered the art of the Hollywood premiere. For decades, he was reliably photographed on the arms of famous actresses, providing the press with exactly the kind of images they needed to maintain his heterosexual illusion. These arranged appearances were a standard industry tactic, a way to offer the public plausible deniability. Behind the studio gates, his sexuality was widely known among industry insiders. But the unwritten agreement of the era was clear: as long as the public only heard whispers, the studios would keep writing the checks. Romero's approach wasn't about creating an elaborate web of lies, it was about managing a very careful omission of the truth. He understood that in a machine as ruthless as mid-century Hollywood, silence was sometimes the most effective shield you could carry. Number 7. Raymond Burr. When you play a character as commanding as Perry Mason, the public expects you to embody that same unwavering authority in real life. Raymond Burr made a career playing formidable masculine men who demanded the truth on television. Yet off-screen, he was orchestrating one of the most elaborate and complex fictions in Hollywood history. For most actors of his era, hiding their sexuality meant staying quiet or occasionally showing up to a premiere with a studio-approved date. Burr went much further. To protect his career and satisfy the relentless curiosity of the press, he essentially authored an entirely fake biography. He told reporters heartbreaking stories of a first wife who perished in a World War II plane crash, a second marriage that ended in divorce, and a young son who succumbed to an incurable illness. Decades later, biographical research heavily suggests these tragedies were entirely fabricated. There are no definitive records of these women, nor of the child. But in the mid-20th century, the strategy worked brilliantly. By wrapping himself in the untouchable armor of a grieving widower and a mourning father, Burr ensured that reporters would respectfully back off, leaving his private life alone. The reality he was protecting was far less dramatic, but profoundly enduring. For over 3 decades, Burr lived a quiet domestic life with his partner, Robert Benavides. They shared a home, cultivated orchids, and eventually ran a vineyard together. But because of the era's unforgiving rules, Benavides was strictly introduced to the public and the press as Burr's business associate. The man who became a television legend by exposing deception in a fictional courtroom had to invent an entire alternate reality just to carve out a peaceful life behind closed doors. Number 8. Rock Hudson. Rock Hudson was the blueprint. For a generation of moviegoers and later television audiences watching Macmillan and Wife, he was the absolute pinnacle of traditional American masculinity. Broad-shouldered, charming, and effortlessly romantic, he was the standard against which other leading men were measured. But the studios didn't just employ Hudson. They managed every conceivable aspect of his existence. He was a highly valuable financial asset, and protecting his bankability meant aggressively hiding the fact that he was a gay man. Living as Rock Hudson meant operating under the constant, suffocating threat of public exposure. When the infamous Confidential magazine prepared to publish an exposé on his private life in the mid-1950s, the Hollywood machine went into overdrive. His representation orchestrated the ultimate industry cover-up, a lavender marriage to his agent's own secretary, Phyllis Gates. It was a strategic, high-stakes business transaction disguised as a wedding designed entirely to appease the press, quiet the rumors, and secure his continued dominance as a romantic lead. Hudson carried the immense psychological weight of this illusion for decades. He played the game exactly as the studio executives demanded right up until the mid-1980s. When his failing health could no longer be kept out of the papers, the public disclosure of his AIDS-related illness fundamentally fractured the carefully manicured facade Hollywood had built around him. It forced an entire country to look past the image of their perfect leading man and face a reality the entertainment industry had spent decades actively suppressing. Hudson was the ultimate product of the Hollywood machine and unintentionally the catalyst that permanently broke its spell. Number 9. Hayden Rorke. For 5 seasons on I Dream of Jeannie. Hayden Rorke played Dr. Alfred Bellows, the perpetually suspicious NASA psychiatrist. His entire comedic purpose on the show was attempting to uncover the truth, constantly trying to prove that major secrets were being hidden right under his nose. The profound irony of his casting was that Rorke himself was successfully hiding a reality from the American public that would have immediately ended his television career. Rorke was a gay man working in the conservative, highly sanitized landscape of 1960s sitcoms. While he made a living playing stuffy conventional authority figures, his private life was defined by a deeply stable, long-term relationship. For decades, he shared his life and home with television director Eustace Addis. What makes Rorke's story distinct from the outright paranoia of other actors on this list is the quiet complicity of his immediate colleagues. Behind the closed doors of the soundstage, his sexuality was not a scandal. It was simply a fact. Co-stars like Barbara Eden later wrote with immense fondness about Rorke and Addis as a couple, noting that they frequently hosted the cast at their home. Yet, this localized acceptance existed in a strictly sealed vacuum. The studio understood that what was quietly tolerated among Hollywood professionals would never be accepted by the network's advertisers or the millions of viewers watching at home. So, the protective barrier remained firmly in place. Rorke was allowed to live his truth among his peers, provided he never brought it into the public spotlight. He spent his career as a beloved television staple, universally recognized on the street, yet entirely unknown to the audiences who watched him every week. Number 10. Dick Sargent. When Dick Sargent stepped onto the set of Bewitched in 1969, television audiences were asked to accept a rather bizarre premise, a literal face swap of the leading man. Viewers seamlessly adjusted to a completely new actor playing Darren Stevens, the perpetually flustered suburban husband. Yet while the network trusted the public to ignore a sudden change in physical appearance, they were absolutely certain that same audience would never accept a gay man in the role. Stepping into an established, highly visible television marriage meant Sargent had to strictly conform to the industry's rigid heterosexual ideals. For the majority of his career, he operated under the pervasive fear that defining his private reality would instantly vaporize his professional one. He played the studio game, kept his head down, and maintained the carefully managed silence expected of a mid-century sitcom star. But the most compelling part of Sargent's story isn't the decades he spent hiding. It is the deliberate way he eventually chose to stop. By the early 1990s, the cultural stakes had fundamentally shifted. Observing the devastating societal toll of the AIDS epidemic, Sargent decided that maintaining an outdated Hollywood illusion was no longer justifiable. In 1991, long after his sitcom days had wrapped, he publicly came out. He didn't just issue a quiet press release, he transitioned directly into vocal advocacy, using the lingering recognition of his television fame to champion LGBTQ+ rights and HIV awareness. Sargent's trajectory represents a vital pivot in the entertainment industry. He spent the prime of his career confined by the terrified silence of the studio system, but he spent his final years demanding the truth, ensuring that he was finally seen exactly as he was.